What if I told you that just 80 years ago, the world came dangerously close to falling under the control of a single dictatorship? In the early 1940s, Nazi Germany had conquered most of Europe. Entire nations had fallen in months. Cities burned. Millions lived under occupation. For a moment in history, it seemed like nothing could stop Adolf Hitler. But across the Atlantic Ocean, a nation was preparing to change the course of the war forever.
In the late 1930s, Europe stood on the edge of a catastrophe that would soon engulf the entire world. At the center of this growing storm was Nazi Germany, led by Adolf Hitler, a man determined to reshape Europe through conquest and domination. In September of 1939, German forces invaded Poland with overwhelming speed and coordination, unleashing a new kind of warfare that the world would soon know as Blitzkrieg, or Lightning War. Tanks, aircraft, and infantry moved together with devastating efficiency, overwhelming defenses before they had any chance to respond. Within weeks, Poland had fallen, and the Second World War had begun. Across Europe, fear spread rapidly as nation after nation realized that the German military machine was unlike anything they had faced before. Over the next months, German armies swept across the continent. Denmark and Norway were quickly taken. The Netherlands and Belgium soon followed. Then came the shocking fall of France in 1940, one of the most powerful nations in Europe, defeated in a matter of weeks. German troops marched through the streets of Paris while the Nazi flag was raised above government buildings. For millions of Europeans, the future suddenly looked dark and uncertain. The Nazi regime now controlled vast territories, stretching from the Atlantic coast deep into the heart of Europe. To many observers at the time, it seemed that Germany had become unstoppable. Across the Atlantic Ocean, the United States watched these events with growing concern. The country had experienced the devastating effects of the First World War only a generation earlier, and many Americans believed that another European conflict should not involve them. The nation focused on strengthening its economy and rebuilding after the hardships of the Great Depression. Yet while the United States remained officially neutral, President Franklin D. Roosevelt increasingly recognized that the balance of power in the world was shifting dangerously. If Nazi Germany dominated Europe, the consequences could reshape global history for generations. Everything changed on the morning of December 7, 1941. In the Pacific Ocean, the Japanese Empire launched a surprise attack on the American naval base at Pearl Harbor. Battleships were destroyed, aircraft were burned on the ground, and more than 2,000 Americans lost their lives in a matter of hours. The attack shocked the nation and transformed public opinion overnight. The following day, the United States declared war. What had once been a distant conflict was now America's war as well. Within days, Germany declared war on the United States, officially bringing the world's most powerful industrial nation into the global struggle. Almost immediately, the immense industrial power of the United States began to reshape the conflict. American factories shifted into wartime production on a massive scale. Automobile plants began producing tanks and armored vehicles. Shipyards launched enormous fleets of warships. Aircraft factories produced fighters and bombers at a pace that stunned even military planners. Millions of workers, including large numbers of women entering industrial jobs for the first time, powered this transformation. In only a few years, the United States would produce hundreds of thousands of aircraft and tens of thousands of tanks. The country became known as the Arsenal of Democracy, supplying weapons not only for its own forces, but also for its allies around the world. While American industry expanded, the Allied nations began planning the operation that would ultimately change the course of the war in Europe. By 1944, the moment had arrived. On June 6th of that year, Allied forces launched the largest amphibious invasion in history known as D-Day. Thousands of ships crossed the English Channel toward the heavily fortified coast of Normandy. More than 150,000 soldiers, many of them American, landed on the beaches under intense enemy fire. The landing zones were covered with obstacles, mines, and machine gun nests. Many soldiers never made it past the water's edge. Yet despite the chaos and heavy casualties, the Allied forces pushed forward. By the end of the day, they had secured a foothold in occupied France, opening the path for the liberation of Western Europe. In the months that followed, Allied armies advanced across France and into the heart of the continent. Cities that had endured years of occupation were finally liberated. When Allied troops entered Paris in August 1944, crowds filled the streets celebrating their freedom. The sight of soldiers being welcomed by civilians waving flags and cheering symbolized the beginning of the end for Nazi rule in Western Europe. Meanwhile, from the east, the powerful Red Army was advancing toward Germany as well. The Nazi regime now faced enormous pressure from both directions. By early 1945, Germany's situation had become desperate. Allied bombing campaigns had devastated much of the country's infrastructure, and German forces were retreating on nearly every front. American troops crossed the Rhine River and moved deeper into German territory, encountering cities reduced to rubble by years of war. The once powerful Nazi war machine was collapsing under the weight of multiple offensives. As Allied forces closed in from the west and the Soviet army approached from the east, the final battle for Germany was approaching. In April of 1945, the war reached its climax in Berlin. The city was surrounded, and the remaining German forces could no longer hold back the advancing armies. Deep beneath the city, inside a fortified bunker, Adolf Hitler realized that the war was lost. Shortly afterward, he died as the Nazi government began to fall apart. German commanders soon started surrendering across Europe as the reality of defeat became unavoidable. On May 8, 1945, Germany officially surrendered to the Allied forces. The day became known as Victory in Europe Day. Across the world, celebrations erupted. In the United States, crowds gathered in streets and public squares, celebrating the end of years of sacrifice and hardship. For millions of people who had lived through the destruction of war, the moment represented hope, relief, and the possibility of rebuilding a shattered world. The Second World War would ultimately become the most devastating conflict in human history, claiming the lives of more than 60 million people. Entire cities had been destroyed, nations had been scarred by years of violence, and the global balance of power had shifted dramatically. Yet, from the ruins of war emerged a new international order. The United States had become one of the most influential nations in the world, playing a central role in rebuilding Europe and shaping the post-war era. Decades later, the events of World War II continue to shape the modern world. The stories of courage, sacrifice, and determination from that era remind us how fragile peace can be, and how important it is for nations to work together when faced with tyranny. Among the many forces that contributed to the defeat of Nazi Germany, the role of the United States proved decisive, helping bring an end to one of the darkest chapters in human history. As the Allied forces pushed deeper into Europe, it became increasingly clear that the balance of the war had changed. The massive industrial strength of the United States was now being felt on every front of the conflict. American factories continued producing tanks, aircraft, and supplies at a scale the world had never seen before. Ships crossed the Atlantic carrying equipment, vehicles, and millions of soldiers determined to bring the war to an end. What had once seemed like an unstoppable German war machine was now facing the combined power of an alliance that had grown stronger with every passing month. In the skies above Europe, American bomber formations flew mission after mission, targeting factories, railways, and strategic infrastructure that supported the German military. These missions were incredibly dangerous. Crews faced intense anti-aircraft fire and enemy fighters determined to stop them. Yet, day after day, these pilots continued their missions, knowing that every successful strike weakened the enemy's ability to continue the war. Their courage became one of the defining elements of the Allied air campaign. On the ground, Allied soldiers advanced through towns and cities that had endured years of occupation and hardship. Many of these soldiers were young Americans who had crossed an ocean to fight in a war far from home. As they moved through liberated towns, civilians gathered in the streets, cheering and waving flags. For those who had lived under the control of Nazi forces, the arrival of Allied troops represented the return of hope and freedom. By early 1945, the situation for Nazi Germany had become desperate. Allied forces continued advancing from the west, while the powerful Soviet armies moved toward Germany from the east. The once powerful Nazi war machine was collapsing under the pressure of multiple fronts. Supply lines were failing, cities were heavily bombed, and the remaining German forces struggled to defend territory that was shrinking with each passing week. In April of 1945, the war reached its final stage as Allied forces closed in on Berlin. The city that had once been the center of Nazi power was now surrounded. Inside the city, chaos and destruction spread as the final battles unfolded. The Nazi regime that had once dominated much of Europe was now facing its inevitable collapse. Shortly afterward, Germany officially surrendered to the Allied forces, marking the end of the war in Europe. The date became known as Victory in Europe Day. Across the world, people filled the streets celebrating the end of years of war, destruction, and sacrifice. In the United States, crowds gathered in cities and towns across the country. After years of uncertainty and loss, the news of victory brought relief and celebration. The nation that had mobilized its industry, its economy, and millions of citizens had played a decisive role in bringing the war in Europe to an end. The Second World War would remain the most devastating conflict in human history. Millions had lost their lives, and entire cities had been destroyed. Yet from the ruins of that war emerged a new chapter in global history. The United States had proven that its strength extended far beyond its borders, helping defend freedom and restore stability to a continent that had been consumed by war. Decades later, the legacy of those events still shapes the modern world. The courage of the soldiers, pilots, and workers who contributed to the Allied victory continues to be remembered. Among them were countless Americans who crossed oceans and risked their lives in the fight against tyranny. Their actions helped bring an end to one of the darkest chapters in human history, and their legacy reminds us that when nations stand together in defense of freedom, even the greatest threats can be overcome.